Hello, and a very warm welcome to the channel. It is time for another American geography reaction video. So this is one that one of you very kindly suggested to me on Instagram. And as soon as I saw it, I knew I had to do it because it's actually something I've been wanting for some time. So it is how the states got their shapes. It is from the Informed Society channel, quite a small channel, I think about 1,000 subscribers. So please do go and support them. Link in the description as always. But it got me thinking because if you look at the eastern states of America are almost European-esque in that they've got sort of at some points they've got quite chaotic borders. And it's not all lovely straight lines. But then you go into particularly inside the Midwest and the West, and the states look like they've been drawn by European colonial powers, if you know what I mean. It looks like an African country that's been invented by France or Britain. So states like Utah, Colorado, extremely straight borders. And I presume it's to do with the process by which America expanded and how states were allowed into the Union. But I'd be really interested to know the details. I'm hoping this video will help. So yeah, let's watch the video and please subscribe.
The
Let's
United
go.
States, the home of McDonald's, Facebook, football, and Donald Trump. Of course, when you see a world map, we
True.
can recognize the shape of the mainland United States, but also we know that Hawaii and Alaska aren't part of the United States. Actually, the U.S. is comprised of 50 different states.
Yeah, so this is what I mean. Like you look at like New Jersey, for example, and its border with Pennsylvania. I mean, admittedly, actually, quite a lot of the eastern ones are quite straight as well. But like New Jersey and Pennsylvania have like a pretty kind of European style border. Whereas, and same with Georgia and South Carolina. Whereas, like Kansas and Oklahoma, or the North Dakota and Montana, just completely straight lines. Obviously, European borders are a bit screwed in the sense that like 120,000 men have died fighting for every village between the various European countries. So our borders reflect our extremely bloody history. So I think you get one up on us on that. But yeah, I'm hoping to find out more.
From the very forest-dense Washington state to the sunny, beachy coast of Florida, when we see a map of the United States with state lines drawn on, you can definitely notice that the borders are perfect lines.
Yeah, a lot of them.
Actually, some of the states are squared shaped. Now, if we compare with China, which they call provinces, they have 34 in total. 31 of them are administrative, 2 special, and 1 disputed. The disputed one is Taiwan, a subject that deserves a whole video on its own.
Yeah.
But if you look at China, you will notice that none of them have any straight lines, and definitely none of them are squared. So how did the states get their shapes?
That's the question.
There are some states that have very distinctive shapes that if shown on their own, not on a map, they would be very recognizable.
Yeah, so I say Texas, Florida, California. Although admittedly, those are probably just the big ones.
Florida, Texas, and California.
That's why.
But do you know which state this is? This one? Or even this one?
Well, the square one I think could be any one of about 8.
Very likely not. Many states, especially in the Midwest, are shaped like a square more than anything else. However, to teach you how the states got their shapes, we'll have to go back in time.
I do think it's so cool. I know there's one place where you can stand in 4 states at once. So I think it's Utah, New Mexico. I'm not too sure about the other 2. Maybe Colorado? I'm not sure. But yeah, I would really like to go there because I think it would be really cool to stand in like 4 states at once.
Time. The consensus is that there are 4 main reasons that influence the creation of the borders of each state.
Okay.
The American Revolution, the construction of the railroad tracks, the 1808 proposal for the Erie Canal, and the political controversies over the issue of slavery. The very first states were the first 13 colonies. Colonization began in Virginia in 1607 through Georgia in 1732. It took a little over 120 years for the English to work their way north and south from Virginia to colonize what became the 13 colonies. Of course, looking at this map, we notice the borders of these colonies are not the same ones that we have today. Most of those early borders have been set using geographical boundaries.
Ah.
For example, New Hampshire and Vermont are separated by the Connecticut River.
Also, wasn't Vermont, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, wasn't Vermont an independent state for a couple of years? Like, it didn't join the Union immediately. And for like 2 or 3 years, it was literally its own country, in the same way that Texas was its own country very briefly.
And to this day, that border is still intact.
But
There
I thought,
are
you
many
say
more
disputed.
examples where state borders end and begin with rivers like New York and Vermont, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, Washington and Oregon. Actually, 34 of the 50 states are separated by rivers.
Okay.
The
That makes
Railroad
sense.
Revolution was also a huge factor in determination of state borders, mainly in the Midwest states. The railroad facilitated the transportation of goods throughout the United States, but it wasn't until 1861 that the railroad track construction made their impact. In Colorado, a gold rush brought more than 100,000 people to the area. At the time, Colorado was not a state and did not become one until 1871. Colorado's gold rush was so economically impactful that in 1867, the Union Pacific Railroad laid the first railroad tracks in Colorado, which consisted of 8.9 miles,
Okay.
crossing through Colorado territory to and from Nebraska near.
It's really interesting because I know, like, compared to other countries, just how important railroads were for America. I guess because of the sheer size of the country. But please again correct me if I'm wrong. I may be, but my understanding is that obviously the kind of once it became independent, the United States slowly began spreading westwards. But I think then California and perhaps Oregon or Washington became states. Maybe not Washington, maybe Oregon became states earlier, or certainly California. And then you kind of there was like a period where you filled in the you kind of filled in the bit in the middle, which is like I guess particularly when the railways were getting built. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that. I might be, but I think it's kind of interesting how like you like grab both sides of the continent and then like work your way in.
Julesburg, Colorado. When determining the size of Colorado, Congress wanted to make it smaller than the people of Colorado wanted. But
Okay.
they pushed hard for Congress to extend Colorado's borders to the west, towards what is current day Oregon. The people wanted this because that is where most of the gold mines were.
Ah,
To make
makes
things
sense.
clear, Colorado people didn't argue in Congress for their borders extension, but because they became so wealthy from the mines, they had power. If Congress would have disapproved the request, the gold mines would have been Oregon's. The railroad
Ooh.
industry flourished because a lot of tracks passed by the gold mines to carry the gold to different locations throughout the United States.
Like, what's super cool is how Americans have managed to keep, with like the sole exception or near sole exception of your Civil War, you managed to keep like all your internal territorial disputes between states peaceful. Because like if this had been in Europe or in Asia or somewhere else, the dispute over those gold mines could have led to hundreds of thousands of people being killed. So it's one of the astonishing achievements of the United States that you guys managed to keep your internal politics in particular so peaceful, or at least territorial disputes.
States. Back in the East, the biggest engineering marvel of its time that shaped commerce on the east coast of the United States, known as the Erie Canal. The canal had a huge influence how certain states were shaped. The canal extends from Albany, New York to Lake Erie. The
Okay.
initial canal extended over 363 miles long, 40 feet wide, and on average 4 feet deep. There were some more later addition canals like the Oswego Canal, Champlain Canal, and Cayuga Seneca Canal. The Erie Canal is the main reason why New York became the largest financial hub of the United States.
Oh.
Its construction began in 1817 and did not finish until 1825. It cost $7 million. That's well over $400 million in today's money. The main reason the Erie Canal was so important in shaping some states in the United States is because it revolutionized the way We did waterway shipping, reduced its costs, and opened the east to the west.
Okay.
Waterways shipping was limited because commerce could only be done between small cities that were located close to these lakes. The small size of these cities meant that the products for those cities manufactured were limited as well. We are talking about cities with population size of 100 to 500 people. The big cities like New York had the products, just no way to
Isn't that just a village?
reach the West.
Or hamlet?
Also, the cost of waterway shipping was really expensive at the time. It cost around $100 to transport 1 ton of material from Buffalo to New York City. After the canal opened, the shipping cost went under $6 a ton. The geographic
It's a big difference.
challenges that people face at the time were hard to overcome without the canal. You see, back in the early 1800s, the East was cut off from the West. Most of the East Coast population was between the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean. You have to remember, back then, there were no cars, no railroads, and the ships at the time were small, so a road trip would have to be done on horses or walking, and at the time it was nearly impossible to go through the Appalachian Mountains. Thanks to the canal, the East was able to...
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because like you forget, or I guess, I'm sure you guys don't forget, but I forget as an outsider just how extreme some of your terrain is. Because you've got like the Appalachian Mountains, you've got the Rockies, um, of course the Great Plains. You've got large sections of land which actually, for probably most of our history, it was pretty difficult for humans to get across them. I mean, not impossible, but until you had kind of like modern transportation technology, it would be a real barrier. And I can totally see then how this like canal, how waterways are so important, how therefore they determine state boundaries. I mean, that's very common. It's very common all over the world, I think, for rivers to be boundaries.
Shipped to all of these new places. Let's say a farmer had a ton of potatoes that they wanted to ship to the city of Duluth, Minnesota from New York City. The farmer sent his product in a 4-horse carriage. The 150-mile trip would reach the Erie Canal. From here, the potatoes will be loaded into a barge, and then its trip begins through the canal until it reaches Buffalo. Here, the barge enters Lake Erie and travels 241 miles across the lake, then enters the Detroit River. From here, the barge enters Lake St. Clair's. 26 miles later, it enters Lake Huron, then Lake Superior, until it reaches the city of Duluth, Minnesota. So, as you can see, the Erie Canal opened the waterways from New York to all this huge...
I didn't realise that the Great Lakes region was also connected, like these great big, like Lake Michigan and Lake Erie and stuff. But you could get from one to the other. I guess presumably that was because they dug canals between them, or was it already like that? I don't know. But I hadn't appreciated like getting to like one of the lakes then gets you to a whole bunch of them.
Huge new area, bypassing the Appalachian Mountains and creating shipping lanes where more products and people were able to travel through. So far, we know that rivers, the Erie Canal, and railroads shaped the states, but we still have the straight line borders missing. We can attribute that to the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. He possessed an equality mentality throughout society. As president, he suggested to Congress that all states should be equal in size and using longitude and latitude coordinates to set the states' sizes. Congress disregarded Jefferson's suggestion about equal size for all states, but they did.
Yeah, I was about to say, because they are nowhere near. Nowhere near. Like Alaska is, not to be offensive, Alaska, you're a little bit bigger than Rhode Island. Don't take it personally.
Latitude and longitude coordinates to establish state lines. As we know, the state lines are not straight because the Earth is a globe. When you see the U.S. map, all the state lines are parallel to the latitude and longitude lines.
Yeah, so
some of these border lines are so long that they go through 3 states before they stop at another state. Also, slavery had something to do with how the states were drawn. As we know, the southern states slavery was legal. while in the northern states slavery was illegal. In 1820, Congress enacted the Missouri Compromise. At the 36-degree 30 minutes north parallel, all states north of this line, slavery was illegal. Anything south of the parallel, slavery was legal. Congress wanted to add Maine to the Union, but in order to have equal number of free and slave states, Missouri was the only state north of the parallel that was a slave state. Texas's panhandle used to be bigger than it is today, but they wanted to keep slaves, so they gave up some land to Oklahoma. Now, two honorable mentions are Texas and California. They chose their own state lines, and when they submitted their borders to Congress, it was not a request, but a take it or leave it deal. Both states had large populations. Also, California had a lot of gold mines, so they were...
That makes sense because, like, of all the American states, probably Texas and California are perhaps the two which could be most viable, obviously viable as independent countries. I think California, if it was a independent state, would have the fifth biggest economy in the world, which would place it just ahead of Britain. I don't think Texas is quite that high, but it would still be pretty up there. So I can kind of understand how in the negotiations with Washington, California and Texas had quite a lot of power in a way that some other areas probably didn't.
Very wealthy, and Texas was an agricultural and mineral-rich state. If Congress didn't approve both states' borderlines, they were going to separate into their own countries and would not join the Union. So, as we know, Congress approved.
And imagine
It took
how
many
different
fights,
history would have been.
arguments, wars, geographical limits in this landscape to set the state lines that we know today. Most people don't even think how the states got their shapes, but as we explained, a lot of financial conflicts and societal issues had a lot to do in the creation of the state borders we have today. States change their borders all the time, so don't be surprised if there's a new state line or if there's even new states in the future.
So when was the last new state created? Was it Hawaii? I'd be really interested to know because I genuinely don't. I know there's proposals to turn Washington D.C. And Puerto Rico into states. As far as I'm aware, they're like the only two kind of serious proposals. I've got no idea if that's good ideas or not. I know it's very politically controversial, but no, but that was really interesting. It makes sense. How kind of the eastern states are some of the more contested ones, I guess, and then California and Texas strong enough to do their own thing, whereas a big chunk of the West is just like that's your state, these are your borders, like it or lump it. But yeah, no, so that was really interesting. If you haven't already, please do subscribe. It would be very kind of you. Please do leave a like, and I hope to see you next video. Thank you.